there's a sense in Norway, I think, across the board that we have a country where a lot is going right. And I think that creates a sense that a lot has been achieved, which makes it harder to motivate people to keep on fighting across the board.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Mathias Hammer is a reporter on foreign affairs for the Norwegian newspaper Klassekampen. And our next guest. Mathias, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do just want to say that the name of that newspaper is very cool. Not only does it sound cool in Norwegian, but it means class struggle in English. So cool both ways.
Yeah. I guess we're, I guess we define ourselves as the daily newspaper of the left. I think is kind of our slogan. It kind of came out of a period of very kind of radical politics in the 70s and 80s, where there was a very active Marxist-Leninist movement, which originally founded the newspaper. And then obviously it became harder to be a Marxist-Leninist. And then after various kind of infights within the newspaper, it then became a broader newspaper for, I guess, readers generally maybe on the left in the Norwegian political landscape, which would be, I mean, it's a parliamentary system, so you have a lot of kind of smaller parties, but that would be kind of the left of the Labour Party, the kind of mainstream progressive party, and then two or three parties to the left of that, which I guess we're looking at, I guess maybe 20-30% of voters. And I guess I think we're the third largest newspaper on print run in Norway. And
when you came down here, and I met you because we were both at the most recent Brookwood rally for the miners, but you told me that that newspaper is funded by the state, is funded by tax dollars, and that's the way that all of the newspapers are funded there. And so, can you just talk to us about the way that the way that newspapers are run there, how they're funded, and maybe some more of that some of the reporting that y'all do at Klassekampen?
Sure. Yeah, I'm very happy to. So in Norway, I mean, there's a lot of state spending going on to keep industries which are seen as desirable and hard to fund within a country of 5.5 million people going, which means a very large chunk of every newspaper gets their budget from the states. I mean, we're looking at, I think it's about, I guess, $50 million, I believe, which is in state subsidies to newspapers for a country of 5 million people, which was a lot to keep, I guess, the media landscape alive. I think you would have one or two of the biggest newspapers alive, but I think it would be very hard for us, for example, to stay alive without that funding. And I think it's very strictly, I mean, it's basically how many subscribers you have is how much funding you get. So there's a very, kind of regulated system. But that's, I think, true of a lot of, I mean, both arts, literature, I guess in this, workplace where it's hard to get funding, it's hard to make it as an artist, as a writer, as a journalist. So having that state's funding, I think, means that you can have a kind of disproportionately large, journalistic scene. Keeps newspapers such as ours alive. So I'm very grateful for that. And I guess
and I think I think that is the importance of media. I think it is lost in this country. It seems to me, and like people just don't think that it's something that is really worthwhile, or they don't understand the importance of it, and they certainly don't think that the state should be funding it, because they think that if it's state funded, that means it's going to be state directed, and that you won't be able to get any actual reporting on government corruption or anything like that. Have y'all run into any issues with disagreeing with maybe the official government line on something? Have there been any editorial issues that y'all have had with being mainly government funded?
Well, I guess the government is a chunk of our funding, but I guess it's not exclusive. But I think because to be honest, and I think here's to the credit of the Norwegian state, given that it's very strictly regulated how this funding is given, it's not, I think it's a fear that it could become politicized in the future, but it's certainly, we've run a lot of stories that are, certainly not government friendly, and certainly been very strong critics of the previous right-wing governments, but also now the kind of lack of support for struggling people, given the kind of energy costs, kind of skyrocketing energy costs in Europe and in Norway. But I think because it's completely based on how many subscribers you have, unless they were to change the laws, there's kind of no way of using that to punish newspapers which are publishing things which are not towing the government line, so to speak. So I think it would be very concerning if they were to change how this is apportioned. But I think at the moment it's quite it works quite well. And I think we're an independent. A lot of the majority of newspapers in Norway are owned by essentially two large newspaper conglomerates, whereas we're independently owned partially, in fact, by the largest union in Norway. Owns about 30% of us, of our kind of stock, I guess, and then the rest is a kind of trust for the newspaper, and then some kind of private individuals who have shares. So I guess in that way, we're also independent of. And I think that's almost more concerning, I think, would be the kind of lack of diversity in ownership of newspapers in Norway, which I think then translates into perhaps a lack of diversity within those kind of huge conglomerates.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, that's something that, if you've read much of Chomsky, one of the things that he says, the way that propaganda functions is not necessarily that you pay somebody and they change their position, but you bring people up who have the same opinions as you, right? And so if you're, corporate media it's not that you're going to censor people who have these, you're just not going to hire people who are like anti-business, right? If you're a corporate media, you're not going to hire a socialist, right? It's just not even going to occur to you, much less, to censor people who have that opinion on your network. You're just not going to bring them on your network, right?
Yeah, and I think that's certainly the case. I mean, we've definitely run a lot of kind of labor stories, which it has been kind of shocking that no one else has touched. Or, I mean, for example, just to talk about one example of that. I mean, I'm on the international desk, which means, I'm less involved in the kind of day-to-day Norwegian labor coverage. But I mean, some of my colleagues, for example, spent the last year reporting on the delivery driving industry in Norway, which is rife with, frankly, just with people breaking the law, with people underpaying, writing illegal contracts, and for these kind of subcontracting kind of companies for large delivery services. And here, it's an industry which in Norway, because we're not in the EU, but we're part of the kind of common part of the Schengen, which means you can have free travel and free work. And it's an industry in which you have a lot of immigrants working who don't speak Norwegian, very often don't know what the contracts they're signing onto are, what it says, but also might not know what Norwegian labor laws look like, quite reasonably. So I think that means that it's been an industry which there's been really a lot of shady business, and a lot of, people getting underpaid, people having, kind of the classic, having to buy every single one of their equipment from the company for exorbitant prices, from uniforms to cars, having very long periods if they leave the company, which they can't work for a rival company, which is illegal in Norway. You can't do that. And I think that's been very satisfying, because it's also led, now there are discussions in Parliament about how to regulate this industry. We've also seen some of the bigger kind of companies here actually hiring some of these workers on fixed contracts rather than on temporary contracts via kind of subcontracting companies. So I think that's been one area where I think a lot of Norwegians were frankly quite naive about what this industry looked like. And I think that's really one of the big labor issues in Norway, is these industries where there's very low unionization rates and a lot of workers who are neither familiar with the Norwegian labor laws or have necessarily the kind of language skills needed. So I think that's an area in which there is a lot of room for reaching out and creating tools and platforms and knowledge sharing to bring knowledge about how do you form a union, what are Norwegian labor laws like.
Yeah, and that's something that we're facing here in America on two fronts, and both of those fronts in that story that you mentioned, the kind of Uberification of so many different trades, turning real good paying union jobs in some cases like taxi drivers into intermittent low paying gig work like Uber, right? I mean, taxi drivers in New York City could make real money, and medallions at one point were worth like $1 million because that was a real job. And now Uber has come in and destroyed these people's livelihoods and put people on just total dead end, low paying, high paced work, and then also on the exploiting of immigrants. We see that in multiple ways here in this country as well, and one of the ways that has been brought to the forefront with this Twitter stuff is the H-1B visa, because we saw when Elon put out there was an email that went out telling folks that you've got to be like hardcore or whatever, long nights and long hours and many days and stuff, and so if you don't reply that you're willing to be hardcore by 5 p.m. then you're going to be fired. And it was pointed out that a lot of Twitter's engineers are immigrants, right? They're immigrants, and they're here on H-1B visas, and H-1B visas are tied to your employment, and not even tied to you having a job, but tied to your employer. Your employer sponsors you as an H-1B visa immigrant, and so if you lose your employer, you're gone. You're deported. Yeah. And so, the immigrants that are here working for Twitter don't have the freedom to say, no, that's insane. I don't want, I want a job and I'm willing to work, but I'm not willing to sleep in my damn office. Like, what, I'm not willing to do that. They don't have the option to do that. Otherwise, they'll be deported, right? And then on the other side, with undocumented immigrants, they don't have anything so formal as that as an employer sponsor, but certainly being undocumented, you can be deported legally anytime. And so anytime, you get too uppity, your boss can report you to ICE and have you deported, so that other folks there, they don't get any ideas, and they're not as familiar, obviously, with labor law in America, which ostensibly offers some protection. It's just difficult to enforce, but, kind of like those folks over in Norway. So that's, it's interesting how, even though, and I want you to talk about some of the differences, like even though I think that there are a lot of ways that Norwegian labor has been able to make more gains and secure their fortress, so to speak, more than American unions have, they're still having some similar problems over there.
Yeah, definitely. And just on the kind of Uberification, I mean, one really big win, I think, in Norway has been a couple of months ago. One of the kind of equivalent kind of food delivery, kind of Uber apps actually unionized after several days of the kind of bicycle delivery drivers in, I guess, kind of Uber Eats equivalent, unionized, and suddenly got both the kind of pay rise, but also actually meant that the company would pay for their equipment, their bikes, and the kind of clothes which you need, which is a non-trivial expense when you're cycling around Oslo in the middle of the winter. And after several weeks of hundreds of them being on strike, and with kind of assistance from the kind of national, kind of centralized union in Norway, they were able to unionize. So that was a big win, and kind of the first of that kind of industry in Norway, which was able to create a union, and unsurprisingly, led to much better working conditions for the cycle deliverists.
Yeah, no doubt. And so let's talk about some of the common working conditions in Norway and what the general labor scene is like. I know that you're not, the labor reporter there, but I think that you've got, kind of a general idea of stuff over there. So just kind of tell us, to the extent that you can, what the labor scene is like over there, what working conditions are like, and how union membership works, stuff like that.
Sure. So I guess we're looking at a country with, I think 50% of the workforce is unionized. It's slightly lower than some other Scandinavian countries, but that's also because in, say, Sweden or Finland, the unions are in charge of your unemployment check, which means you kind of have a further incentive to join a union. Whereas in Norway, that's organized by the state. But I think that makes it the country with the highest percentage of unionization, which doesn't have unemployment checks organized by your union, I believe. And then I think one massive difference is that there's a lot of sectoral bargaining, a lot of sectoral agreements. So, for example, I'm in the kind of Norwegian Union of Journalists, and every 4 years they meet with the kind of Norwegian journalists, the kind of companies, an association of the companies, and then kind of create a standard across the whole sector, which will then be a kind of baseline for all newspapers to follow. And then in the local newspapers, there will then also be discussions for any further changes or specific needs or further, greater benefits on top of that baseline. But I think that means that it's much more common to have, I guess, sector-wide strikes. I mean, it's less common to have, for example, when I met you down in Brookwood at the UMWA strikes there. They've been, there's one company's workers on strike. Whereas, in Norway, it's much more common for a whole sector to go out on strike because you have a kind of norm of big sectoral agreements. And I think another big difference is that the unions are mostly organized into essentially two very large organizations, which are kind of associations of different unions for different sectors, which means that there's a lot of collaboration. For example, my union is part of LO, which is basically the landsorganisation. It's kind of it's called like kind of the national union, is kind of what it translates to, which then involves everyone from journalists to I think the kind of one coal mining workers are in there, but also hospital workers, some people who employed by the government, which means that if one sector goes on strike, it's also not uncommon for the national union to then pull out people in other sectors as well. So I remember I was working in a school at one point a couple of years ago, and then just as like an assistant teacher, and then I was pulled out on strike because the hospital, the nurses were going on strike, and I think that means that you can have. I know that's illegal in this country if I'm not mistaken, and I think that's something which gives a lot of. Means you can really shut down a lot if need be. If and when these kind of national level sectoral bargaining fails.
Right. And I think that is there's a reason that bosses wanted to get that in the law as soon as possible. Like immediately after the NLRA passed, the National Labor Relations Act, that was one of the things that they were gunning for, to put that in the Taft-Hartley bill that passed a few years later, was a ban on secondary strikes. Because if you can start to shut down entire industries, affect other bosses, that puts a lot of power in the workers' hands, or that recognizes the power that is in their hands rather than trying to take it away from them, right?
Yeah, I think two other differences I'd just like to highlight quickly, if that's all right, is both. Sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought here real quick, but let me see if this comes back to me.
Two other differences between U.S. and the Norwegian labor scene. One is that you're not allowed to hire replacement workers. This was kind of a crazy thing to me when I was in Brookwood, because we went up to we marched along, blocked the road up to one of the mines when I was there with you, and then there were just kind of scabs and other workers just keeping the mine going, admittedly at a lower capacity, but you can't do that in Norway. If the workers go on strike, you aren't allowed to have your employees fulfill their tasks. In some cases, like bosses
will do that. Like, for example, in the hotel industry, it's quite common that if the hotel workers go on strike, in praxis, that means that the people running the hotel will attempt to do the kind of do the kind of cleaning work and to kind of keep things ticking over. But in theory, you're neither allowed to hire nor have people fulfill those tasks while the strike is ongoing, which I think means you can't have the type of situation which is tragically unfolding in Brookwood, in which the mines are still open despite 600 days of, or almost 600 days of an ongoing strike.
David in the chat was wondering about if sectoral bargaining in Norway creates complacency among workers and less militancy. And I think from our conversations on and off the air, it would seem like no. But what is your thought about the effect that sectoral bargaining has on the rank and file?
I think yes, in some ways. Like, I think when I come to the US, I'm always struck by the kind of militancy among kind of grassroots organizers and labor movements in the US. And I think to some extent in Norway, in effect of that, a lot of that happening kind of at a kind of top, a kind of top-down approach, which I think does mean in a lot of workplaces, people will be perhaps less active if they're not, they'll be a union member perhaps, but not perhaps that's active and that's aware, following that closely, kind of minor violations of labor law, for example. But I think also more broadly, I think there's a sense in Norway, I think, across the board that that labor relations are pretty good, that we have a country where a lot is going right. And I think that creates a kind of complacency in which, which I think a lot of our readers, for example, were shocked at the kind of working conditions among, say, delivery van drivers. I think there is definitely complacency about a sense that a lot has been achieved, which I think makes it harder to motivate people to keep on fighting across the board.
Well, let's shift gears to your U.S. reporting. You said you're on the foreign desk over at Klaskampen, and you are in the U.S. right now. You've been in the U.S. for a couple weeks, and I think you'll be here for another. So how, what are the things that you've been reporting on, and is there anything that, what have you been surprised by or had, assumptions confirmed by, just talk to us about your general impression of what's going on here, some of the stories that you've been reporting on.
Sure. So I guess I came here a week before the midterms, and I had a week kind of doing a bit of kind of midterm stuff. I wrote a piece on the Fetterman campaign up in Pennsylvania, and one piece kind of generally about the state of progressive politics among, I guess, at a kind of congressional level going into the midterms. And then came down to Alabama, where I had the one piece where I met you, writing on the ongoing strike at UMWA, which I think was both a piece which I think really resonated with readers. I got I think it came out yesterday, and I think I got a lot of emails, a lot of people really struck and surprised both at the nature of the strike, but also the things which are going on in the background, like them getting at one point, a $13.3 million fine, even if it's reduced, the fact that at one point it seemed plausible that they would have to pay for, the company's lost profits. That just seems batshit crazy to me and to some of our readers, like even the fact that was plausible, even if thankfully, that didn't happen, or, being banned from picketing from picket lines for a couple of months. I think that was a story which I think, it also, resonates with our readers, who are lots of, I think labor issues is a kind of bread and butter issues for us. And then, I also wrote a piece in Alabama, one piece on the attempt at creating, or the ongoing Supreme Court case on gerrymandering, I guess trying to create a second majority black district. and which, and I guess kind of future of the Civil Rights Act, and then went to DC and did a little bit of, I guess Trump's presidential nomination is kind of, kind of sucks a lot of the air out of the room, I think, when it comes to how Norway views the US. I mean, I think there's kind of a kind of fascination with that side of America and kind of what it's kind of hard to understand, I think, coming from Norway.
Right.
That's hard to understand for us too, and we're living through it.
Yeah. Well, Mathias, is there anything else that you wanted to, that you wanted to share, you wanted to talk to us, talk about, or even ask us about?
One thing, actually, that I would be interested, or because I was just so shocked by this NLRB decision to fine UMWA the $13.3 million, including the lost profits. And I never really got, is that something which you can legally be fined for in this country, like for the fact that you're on strike and your company, as a result of that, is of course making less money? Because that just seems like it would be kind of crippling for
Jacob, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that it is not yet a practice. And the way I interpreted this was that Warrior Met was seeing how far they could push the boundary. My understanding is that there are some court cases, one potentially even a Supreme Court case, that's going to be along the same lines, and it's going to possibly have some lasting impact on whether or not this becomes a standard practice in any strikes, because you're right. The whole point of the strike is to hit at the profits, right? So if you have to then pay back the damage that you do,
this is like you just cripple the whole point. Seems
right. I mean, at that point, your legal right to strike has been diminished to almost be a right only on paper.
Right. And my understanding of the law is definitely that just outright, charging you for lost profits is not legal, but there are potential ways to get you to cover some of that, which is what Warrior Met was trying to do, and what this other company out of Washington is trying to do that I think you alluded to, Adam, is headed for the Supreme Court. And so what Warrior Met was trying to do, it was, I think that they were alleging that, or they were trying to get them to cover lost profit that they would say was not derivative of their withholding their labor, which is legal and federally protected, but was derivative of their unlawful actions, like property destruction or blocking scabs from entering the mine, things like that. Yeah. And so I think that that's what they would say, and I don't think that it's a practice even to fine unions for lost profits in those situations. But Warrior Met was trying that, and the other situation where bosses are trying that is this case with cement truck drivers, where the cement truck drivers notified their bosses that they were going on strike at this time, and they went on strike at this time, and there were cement trucks that had cement in them still churning, and the cement dried and messed up the trucks, and so that's a lot of damage there. And they're trying to get them to pay those damages, and the workers are like, well, we told you, so you could have fixed it if you had wanted to, but you didn't. And so now I'm very, very worried about that case in front of this Supreme Court with the 6-3 conservative supermajority. So I don't know, ask me in a year, and the answer may be different, but as of right now, no, you can't. Unions don't have to pay for lost profits right now, anyway.
But it definitely was a shocking proposal that it. And I agree with you. Like the fact that it even was taken seriously and not just immediately laughed out of the room is a red flag. That's not the good kind of red flag. It's not promising for the future, and we have a judiciary that is so dominated by the business class and by right-wing ideologues that it is not looking good on the legal front. And that's why I think the organizing that we've seen and the grassroots energy through the organizing has been really a little bit of hope because the legal framework is so against us as working class people, and because the legal framework is even under threat, as bad as it is, it's likely to get worse. At least seeing some people power and seeing that grassroots organizing has given some of us hope that, you know, we can turn things around and we can rebuild labor in spite of the law and the judges. Mathias, one thing I wanted to ask before we let you go, I'm interested in the cultural aspects, and I know you haven't spent a ton of time over here, but you've gotten enough to at least have some sense of our culture versus yours. And I'm interested the comparison and contrast between Norway and America when it comes to consumerism and our conceptions of class, especially just the concept of working class. Who defines themselves as working class? Who sees themselves as working class? So those were two areas of the culture, the consumerism part and the conception of class. I was interested if you've gotten any, you know, if you have any observations on that.
I guess on class, I think one, and kind of class identity. I mean, I think Norway certainly has both has a pretty proud working class of, you know, the people who kind of take the kind of legacies of the trade union. I mean, the reason we have strong labor laws, you know, is because of the battles of, you know, of unions in the past. Right. I think it's, you know, it's not like that came out of nowhere. You know, I think that's, you know, I mean, I think every big gain in Norwegian labor laws is because of, you know, very strong fights of the labor unions and the fact that they've been powerful enough that they've been able to, you know, really be a driving force in national level politics, and kind of they're historically and kind of weakening, kind of unfortunately, the ties between the Labour Party and the labor movement. But historically, those have been extremely strong, but have kind of weakened as the Labour Party have, I guess, taken a kind of neoliberal turn that it's maybe still stuck in. But I think as far as consumerism goes, I mean, I think this is maybe a slightly different way of going at this, but I think there are a lot of things. Perhaps this isn't about consumers. Perhaps I'm just answering the question which I'm thinking of rather than the question you asked.
And that's totally fine.
Apologize for that. But one thing I've been struck by is just having the welfare state in Norway, I think, is really important for creating, I guess, sufficient conditions which allow for workers' power. And here I'm thinking especially about healthcare. Right. I mean, in Norway, you have the same healthcare if you have a job, if you're on strike, if you're unemployed. You know, it's covered by the state no matter what. And talking to, you know, a lot of the miners who are on strike, I mean, that's a huge issue for them. You know, they need to find jobs which will hopefully give, and, you know, it's hard to find jobs which had equivalent healthcare. And that's like, you know, makes it much harder to go on strike, makes it much harder to leave your job. You know, you're kind of stuck in a lot of ways which, you know, with really high expenses if you're not doing that. And I think that's one area which I think that kind of the overlap between progressive politics and labor union and labor movements is kind of so fundamentally clear that you can, you kind of need that to be able to, you know, you need to be able to take care of your health. You need to be able to, you know, get medicine. And I think that's something which, you know, is kind of a necessary condition for the Norwegian labor movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a great illustration on how the welfare state provides a foundation. It provides breathing room. That's, you know, it's a piece of leverage that in Norway is not currently being used against the workers in Norway, right? Because, as you said, whether they're unemployed, they're on strike, they have health care. And here, that is a weapon that the employer class can wield against us. And it's something that I think changes the power dynamics when you know to leave a job or to strike a job is to possibly miss out on medicine, life-saving treatments, dealing with injuries. A lot of those miners, of course, have numerous injuries of various sorts, from black lung to, knees that are busted up and bad backs, and that's no light matter to go without health care. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That is a very important point, I think, to illustrate the differences because workers are entering the negotiation from a different point, a different position. Knowing that healthcare is taken care of, knowing that there are certain elements of the welfare state that are going to be there, win, lose, or draw, provides a sense of security for a family that we simply don't have. And I think that's why fear is such a major factor in the organizing that we're doing in the United States, is dealing with the fear that's very real and very, grounded in reality.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Mathias, foreign affairs reporter for Klaus Kampen. Do y'all have like an English version of the paper online or anything like that, or is it all in Norwegian?
Unfortunately not. I think Google Translate's not bad with Norwegian, but we also hit you up with a pretty hard paywall. So
can you send us a print version? Maybe. Do y'all do print?
Yeah. I can. If you send me an address, I can get the newspaper to send a copy over.
Yeah, I would love to see. The copy where you write. If you have a print copy where you're writing anything about Rookwood, I'd love to. Yeah. I'd love to see that. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I can. If you just email me or message me an address.
All right, Mathias.
I think that's fantastic, and I really, really want to just express my appreciation to you as a journalist who's not from Alabama, not from the United States, but the fact that you are interested in our labor struggles and that you are covering what's happening with our working class here, it means a lot.
Yep.
Well, I think there really is, and this is maybe a good note to end on, a lot of admiration and a lot of attention being paid to the American labor movements. I think in part because, you guys are fighting under really difficult conditions. It's not easy, but there is energy, there is momentum, or so it seems, at least from Norway, in the labor movements. I mean, things like obviously things like the Amazon union, that's gotten a lot of attention in Norway. I think there is a lot of solidarity and a lot of people, rooting for you guys and kind of following the American labor politics, I think, more closely than one might expect.
It's fantastic.
Right. Sounds great. Mathias, appreciate it. Appreciate you taking the time this morning. Let's keep in touch, all right?
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.